All right. I want to say good evening, but I think it's for some it's good for you. Ludmila, it's good morning. For some, good afternoon, and for the Dutch people, good evening. Welcome to our webinar around neurodiversity, a topic that I'm very excited to dive into a little bit more. Before we dive into this, some very practical notes, and then I would love for Ludmila and Kat to briefly introduce yourself, of course, is that we do have a chat and a questions functionality in this program. You will see that on the right side of your screen, so feel free to ask all questions that you might have, and we will try to answer them as much as we can. Then, Ludmila, I would like to ask you to briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Ludmila Praslova. I'm professor of psychology and graduate Industrial Organisational Psychology at Vanguard University in Southern California, so it is morning here. And my focus is inclusion and diversity in general because I started in global diversity. But for the last several years, I was very much focusing all of my work on neurodiversity in the workplace and how neurodiversity can be best integrated with our employment practices, which I believe will benefit all people in the workplace.
Great, thank you so much. Kat, would you also like to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Hi, welcome everyone. I am Kat, the Community and Event Manager here at Equalture. So I'm sort of the eyes and ears behind all of our webinars and events. Hi to everyone in the chat. I see a very, very international crowd today. Finland, Portugal, Vancouver, Singapore. That's amazing. So I'm super, super excited for that conversation between Charlotte and Ludmila. And we also have a brand new community. So any questions that don't get answered during the webinar, we're going to take to the Q&A thread in the community. And I've already posted a link, and I'll post it again at the end of the webinar, so you can follow us there.
Thank you. And then last but not least, my name is Charlotte. Sorry, I skipped this slide. My name is Charlotte. I'm one of the founders of ECulture. We are an HR tech startup based in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. To briefly introduce why this topic specifically interested us to host a webinar, ECulture develops game-based assessments, so assessments but in a gamified format, that we really promote customers to use at the very start of the hiring funnel and scrap the resume eventually to make sure that your hiring decisions are actually based on factual insights instead of gut feeling. Therefore, one of the topics that obviously really interests us is how can we be as equal as and inclusive as possible. And neurodiversity obviously is a very big topic in this conversation. So Ludmila, I'm very much looking forward to your insights today. Practical note, we will start with some general information around neurodiversity. And Ludmila, of course, we had a chat last week to already briefly discuss the webinar today. If you speak about different aspects of neurodiversity, it's not that everything applies to all the different categories. So we will start with neurodiversity in general, and we will focus a bit more on autism specifically afterwards. So I think that's good to know for everyone. What I would really like to start with, Ludmila, is some terminology, because I think that most people really would like to get the terminology right, but it also can be a little bit confusing or maybe unknown for them every now and then. So what I would like to ask you is maybe to start with a brief explanation of what is the difference between neurotypical and neurodivergent?
And in general, people are very hard to classify because people could have all kinds of differences. But when it comes to neurodiversity, the term very specifically originated by Judy Singer and Harvey Bloom at the very end of 90s when they were discussing originally autistic functioning, how it's different but not abnormal. So that's where the word neurodiversity was born, and then it was applied to other types of developmental differences such as ADHD or dyslexia. So people came to use the term neurodivergent to those who were different from the expected averages of neurofunctioning, and then people who kind of fell into that average came to be called neurotypical, but their definitions of neurodivergence sometimes can include other characteristics in addition to the original ones. So people could include PTSD or acquired neurodiversity from trauma, which also makes the neurotypical definition a little bit fuzzy as well. Some people go as far as to say that introversion is a difference, even though it's almost half of the population. So it depends on how broadly you apply the neurodivergence term, but in general, what is typical? The people for whom the world designed it would be called neurotypicals, and the neurodivergent people who function a little bit differently and sometimes are kind of left outside of what's expected from the average person.
Yeah, check. Hey, and what I see every now and then, which also brings me to the second slide, is that cognitive diversity and neurodiversity are oftentimes terms that a lot of people use interchangeable. However, there is a difference, obviously. Could you also explain the difference between these two terms?
Mm-hmm. And neurodiversity, again, has very specific origin. It comes from the thinking about differences in development as variations of humanity, just important to humanity as biodiversity is to the world. So it has, again, Carrie Bloom and Judy Singer coined this word. When it comes to cognitive diversity, it's not as well defined because people have used it in many different ways. So some people use it as synonymous with neurodiversity because somehow they think it's a more polite way to say that. Other people use it as differences in, let's say, upbringing or national culture that people bring to the workplace, differences in things like faith and values and education. So cognitive diversity is less well defined, and it would have some overlap with neurodiversity because some cognitive diversity would stem from neurodiversity and different thinking style, like people talk about dyslexic thinking or autistic thinking. But neurodiversity is not just cognition in a rigid sense of term. It's also emotion. It's also physical experience of the world because our sensory differences are also linked to neurodiversity. So there is some overlap in that both refer to differences in thinking styles and the likelihood that some people will come with this kind of ideas versus other people who come with very different kinds of ideas, but they're not the same, and neurodiversity is more specifically linked to a variety of differences in psychological functioning.
Cool, thank you so much. Also for clarifying this, to make a confession here, I also used to every now and then use those two terms interchangeable. So it's yeah, of course, it doesn't happen on purpose, but it's always good to have a clear definition of what we mean by that.
It also happens in some literature as well, so you won't be alone.
Yeah. I looked up some statistics prior to this webinar because I think it's also always a nice way to start a discussion. So there were three statistics mainly that really stood out for me. I think, first of all, I start from the left side, that 15 to 20% of the global population is actually neurodiverse, a very big part of society. I think the middle one is something that a lot of researchers, I think amongst your researchers as well, Ludmila, is what we really try to promote. It has been proven that neurodiverse teams are more productive than neurotypical teams. So there is, in my opinion, a clear business case on why to fight for neurodiversity also in a company setting. The last one specifically is a statistic, I think, Kat, we also spoke about it prior to the webinar, that really surprised me negatively. I was assuming that unemployment rates would be significantly higher for neurodiverse people. But when I found that 75% of the autistic people in the UK are unemployed, and that's 55 in the Netherlands, according to the last research, it's a very high number. why do you think it's, or maybe let's rephrase the question, what makes it so difficult for autistic people to even get their foot in the door?
Well, I call it the paradox of autism employment, because autistic people can be very capable of doing the job, but most organizations, hiring is based on things that are just used for every job without thinking about particular skills needed for the jobs, and that are not particularly valid to this particular job. And very often they're just like how charming you are in the interview, which has nothing to do with the person is actually supposed to do. And we do know from the research that when people just look at the product of work of the autistic individual, the product actually tends to be better than the average. But the personal impression, there's just something about style and self-presentation that makes usually neurotypical interviewers go, oh, there's just something that's different, and most people equate different with bad and I don't like it. And that is one of the reasons. And then when you don't have very much on your resume, it's harder and harder to get a job. So with time, the fewer jobs you had, the less likely you are to get into the jobs. But very often it comes from the mismatch between the actual job requirements and all the other stuff that people consider requirements for hiring, but they're actually very subjective evaluations that have very little to do with performance.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I heard you saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that similarity bias has quite an impact. Well, of course, lots of different biases, but I think similarity amongst one of those. We tend to prefer people who look like us. So there's definitely a bias aspect involved during the interview. I also read an article yesterday evening, and by the way, going to make sure that it's included in the recap after the webinar today, because I forgot to include it, that almost half of the hiring managers, I think that was a research in the UK, also explicitly said that they prefer not to hire an autistic person. So apart from like the unconscious biases that arise during an interview, for example, my takeaway from an article like that is also like those hiring managers have a very particular view on autistic people in the workplace, and a very negative one. So what do you think are the biggest misperceptions that, for example, hiring managers have with regards to autistic people?
There is a lot of research where people also gave some qualitative responses, and this is a US study where managers said that autistic people are just going to be very hard to manage. It's going to take up all of my time. They're going to create problems, which obviously comes from stereotypes and just inaccurate portrayals in media, because autistic people, if anything, are less likely to create workplace drama. But for some reason, there are very negative stereotypes that a lot of autistic people have problematic behaviors, which is just not true. Autistic people tend to focus on work and create very few issues. Sometimes autistic people ask questions to be sure how to do the job. Once they get how to do the job, typically they focus very intently on the job itself, and the stereotypes are definitely very far from reality of majority of people. But there's all kinds of other things, like people would actually use obscenities to describe what they expect from autistic behavior in the workplace. And it's obviously not based on anything other than what society throws at you just through the media.
Yeah. So maybe during the interview process, similarity bias plays a big role, but maybe even far before that, it's stereotyping bias. Maybe that's playing a big part here.
Yes.
Yeah. By the way,
if you know someone is autistic, you might just go with stereotypes. If not, you might just kind of perceive something different and go with similarity bias.
Definitely. By the way, for everyone who is listening today, Ludmila and I discussed up front, like, should I say people on the spectrum or autistic people? Because I really do want to use the right language. So autistic people is at least a more inclusive one to use. So that's also why I'm using the term today. It brings me to the more positive side of the story.
Charlotte, can you go back quickly?
Absolutely.
Julia asked in the chat, by neurodiverse teams, do we mean teams that are made up of only neurodiverse individuals? Or do we mean teams that are mixed, neurodiverse and neurotypical, when we say they're 30% more productive?
Can I answer that? So when we're talking using the word neurodiverse, that refers to humanity, combination of people. And because individual is not neurodiverse, individual is neurodivergent, so neurodiverse teams would be the mix of all representation of neurotypes of humanity.
Cool, thanks. This is something that I found in one of your articles, which is, I think, a very impressive statistic, more on the positive side. If you would have to, and I think for most of the people in this webinar, we could all come up with some examples, but if you would have to convince a hiring manager on the business case of hiring an autistic person, what would be the top 3 characteristics that you would promote most in terms of productivity?
I honestly do not like business case because it dehumanizes people, and it kind of says, well, here's a tool and I have a better tool, go ahead and use it. That said, many people expect business case and want business case. So we often use the data from like this statistic from JP Morgan that autistic people are more productive than the average person in the same job. What that means is that the person was selected very specifically for this position and the talent matches the job. Why autistic people can outperform qualified neurotypical people in the same job is autistic people are very much focused on the job, so they spend less time with office drama and irrelevant things, because if we are selected for the job we like, we really just want to dedicate our time to it. There are also differences in learning. So due to focus and interest, autistic people can sometimes learn a lot faster. And also we integrate learning faster, and we kind of see connections between different items, which also facilitates learning. So the same JP Morgan internal study also found that autistic people well matched to job learned faster. Significantly faster than neurotypical people. And autistic people do tend to be very loyal and very committed. But I really don't like this kind of sales approach. And rather than saying, okay, so autistic people are geniuses, not all of us are geniuses. And there is also a human case and a dignity case, that you don't have to be, super gifted to be valuable in the workplace, that autistic people with average abilities also bring their dedication and loyalty and specific skills to the workplace. So just promoting autistic genius, which unfortunately sometimes we have to just to break through the stereotypes, but in general, then I would also talk about that the value of equality and human dignity, because somebody in the chat mentioned a lot of people are homeless, and that is a justice point in addition to business point. But if you want to go with business case, then there are many studies about creativity and enhanced learning.
Yeah, and I, by the way, fully agree with what you're saying. It's a shame that we are some sort of turning this into business case. I think it's something that we learned from the general topic of DE&I, that companies should see eventually some sort of a hard business case what we are doing. But I completely agree that it's sad that we, at the first place, had to come to a point where it turns into statistics and a sort of a commercial case in order to make a change. So yeah, fully agree there. If we would move on to the hiring process specifically, because I think that a lot of people that are in the webinar today are also very interested in seeing, hey, how can we actually promote autistic people getting further through the hiring funnel, and how can we make the hiring process also more comfortable and inclusive in general? What would you say are the biggest things that we should improve / change in the hiring process in order to make the hiring process more inclusive in general, but also specifically for autistic people?
The key is actually making it valid for anybody, because again, people throw all kinds of irrelevant junk into hiring processes, and that is the key problem. They just kind of assume that if you can talk smoothly about whatever random things, rain, then you're going to perform well because you can charm the hiring manager, which obviously doesn't work. So if we focus job descriptions on specific things the person needs to do, then autistic people, and by the way, other underrepresented people, are more likely to apply. If you don't throw in, irrelevant teamwork just because, or doing other things as assigned, but just focus on the essentials of the job, and then measure ability to do the essentials of the job with as valid instruments as possible, for example, job samples. Because when we start doing other things like interviews that can trip over autistic people, or long essays that are really not essential for the job performance, but they can trip over dyslexic people, then our system is not valid. We're not selecting best people for the job to begin with, because we're not measuring what's actually relevant, and we're making decisions on things that are not relevant. And it is also unfair to specific groups that could do the job but cannot do all this other stuff that people put into the hiring process. Yeah. That's in a nutshell. Make it valid.
Yeah, and what is interesting, oh, sorry, and what is interesting to maybe show quickly, I'm making the screen big for myself now. I have no clue if that works for everyone like that, but I mentioned, of course, at the start that we develop game-based assessments, and what we do at the end of completing an assessment is we always provide candidates with the opportunity to leave a rating and feedback, and they can also voluntarily participate in scientific studies. And one of those studies being studies into different aspects of neurodiversity. So prior to this webinar, I asked our data science to look into the comments that autistic people specifically left on the question, what did you like and what did you dislike about the hiring process? And what was, I think, interesting to see is that 3 different things came out very concretely. The right one is most centered to our product, so I will skip that one for now. But the 2 that I found really interesting is the fact that a lot of people said, I really don't like open-ended questions, open-ended screening questions. Motivation letters were also oftentimes mentioned, but open-ended screening questions even more. And the fact that they would eventually prefer an assessment over an interview. Can you relate to those 2 comments that most people left?
Absolutely, because for many autistic people, open-ended questions are very vague, and they can be answered in too many different ways, and we don't know what kind of social assumptions don't go into it, so it can be very unnerving. What if I say it wrong? Especially if questions are intentionally vague and they feel like trick questions, and it's very hard to see relevance to the workplace. And again, interviews have elements of social performance, social anxiety, and if, let's say, my job is focused on writing or technical work, why do I need to worry about those things and performing under social pressure if I can actually show and demonstrate how I can do the job and that I have actual skills relevant to the job? So that's why the preference to showing rather than telling, because being good at telling is not necessarily something that translates at actual productivity and performance.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, and because most companies will have job interviews, or maybe there could be an assessment prior to that, but I think that 99% of the companies eventually still would like to see people on an interview. Would you then, for example, also recommend to, because we are thinking a lot about structuring interviews with interviews questions, would it be more beneficial to then, for example, ask situational judgment questions versus, hey, mention your strengths and weaknesses, for example?
Yes, something that is also relevant to the job, because people are very much like what vegetable would you be in your first life? So that kind of thing just has nothing to do with anything that throws people off. But if you have a structured interview that has judgments about particular what you would do if this problem that came up, the actual problem that happens in this particular job, it makes a lot more sense. Another thing that people often ask for is seeing interview questions in advance to take care of anxiety. Some companies actually do that now, but even if you don't, then having structured questions that are very specifically relevant to the job is very helpful.
Yeah, check. Hey, we do have a couple of minutes left. I mentioned it, of course, at the beginning, but Kat is also going to explain everyone in a bit how you can still ask Ludmila questions after the webinar, because we do have a community where Ludmila will still be for another 30 minutes to answer questions. However, something that I do want to touch upon still is the Canary code that you developed, because I think it's a very interesting and valuable model. So we will also include it in the recap of the webinar. Could you briefly explain this model that you created and also what goal it serves?
Well, it serves the goal of eliminating bias on all stages of talent management process, because even if we cleaned up hiring, there are still inequities in how people are treated in the workplace. Coworker behavior, bullying affects autistic people, for example, more than others. Neurodivergent people are less likely to get promotions because of biased promotion system. So I wanted to look at everything from how job descriptions are created, to how jobs are advertised, to hiring, to training, to promotion systems, so that neurodivergent people are more likely to be in leadership positions where they can influence organizations. And looking at what works for all kinds of people in the workplace, not just for autistic people who are often self-refer to that to ourselves as canaries in the coal mine, more sensitive to bad things. So like if there's bullying, if there's any bad in the workplace, autistic people are more influenced by that. But how to create places where air is good for everybody, where environment is good for everybody, more sensitive and more marginalized, and then obviously for everyone else who is less vulnerable. And the same things come up over again: organizational justice, treating everyone with clear procedures, transparency, participation in decision making so that people can have an input in how their work is organized. We also want to have valid hiring, as I mentioned several times today, as well as valid data for all kinds of decision making, such as promotions. So that's the idea. If we embed those principles, such as participation, validity, and organizational justice and transparency in all of our workplaces, in each step of the talent cycle, we're going to end up with more inclusive workplaces and workplaces that are less stressful and more positive for everyone.
Yeah, it's a very, I really like this model. I studied it already yesterday. But we are, as I mentioned, definitely going to include it in the recap of this webinar, because it's a much more elaborate model than, of course, the time I gave you to introduce it. But yeah, I definitely recommend everyone involved in hiring not hiring, talent management, from hiring to promotion and everything in between, to definitely check it out and see how you can practically implement it in your hiring process. I also see, Ludmila, that you triggered some people, because the chat is very busy today. I saw some people, by the way, commenting we should have a community for this. Maybe, Kat, this is a good way for you to briefly introduce our community, because we can, I think, create a separate group for discussions around neurodiversity specifically. But I would like to hand it over to you for this part.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is my keyword. This is where I come in. This is my cue. We have a community called the Breaking Bias Community. It's for all professionals who are passionate about unbiased hiring, about any and all DE&I topics. So neurodiversity is definitely a core topic that we're now covering as well. So please follow us over there. I've opened a thread already where you can ask all the questions that still remain. I also want to quickly say I am providing additional resources in the recaps I'm sending out. So tomorrow around midday, you'll receive a recap from me, and then a follow-up recap on additional resources by Ludmila. So fear not, there will be a bit more information than what we were able to cover. I've also written down the questions, and if you can't join us, I'll put your question in, we'll answer it, and then join us later on in the community. We'll open a space as well for you all to connect, which would be so lovely if we can continue the conversation there.
It's funny, Ludmila, because Kat and I, you were there as well, of course, before it started. We were actually discussing, shall we add a specific group in the community if we see that a specific topic really triggers people? Well, I think we managed to trigger people today, or you managed to trigger people today. So thanks so much for that. I think that the questions that have been asked in the chat are, I think somehow answered. I think there will be much more questions for you. So I would like to invite everyone, go to community.eculture.com. Ludmila will be there for the next 30 minutes. So you can ask any questions that you still might have. And maybe, Ludmila, you don't have time to answer them all, but let's see what we can get.
Maybe we can. I'm happy to answer more and just send it to you, as long as we can find some way to disseminate it to people. I also suspect a lot of it is already answered in some of my articles.
Absolutely, yeah. You have amazing articles on HBR and different resources. So maybe we can also share that in the community so people check it out. Ludmila, before we head on to the community, is there one last piece of advice that you haven't said yet that you would still like to say in this webinar?
People just get so nervous about language. Should you say autistic? Should you say person with autism? And preferences differ. So just don't worry. Ask each individual what they prefer, and we're always learning, so don't be afraid to learn, because I think sometimes people are just so nervous about doing things wrong they don't try. But just try with a learning attitude, and that usually helps everyone in the process.
Cool, thanks so much. Kat, thanks for helping me get some structure into this webinar. Ludmila, thanks so much again for joining, and I will be in the community as well to look at the questions and the answers. And I think, given the response on the chat, we might want to have a follow-up webinar on this topic, where we can dive a little bit deeper into some topics. But for now, thanks so much, and for everyone who joined the webinar today, thanks so much for being here, and I hope that it was of any help for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I'll see you in the community. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the great questions. Bye.
Ciao.